First of all, getting the information for these charts involved a huge amount of effort, as I read decades of all the old Outdoor Life articles that were available to me. I also got some more information from a book that was titled Ballistics in Perspective. It was written by Mike LaGrange, and it is out of print now. They didn't make that many copies in the first place. The first section of this video will show the penetration of various calibers in inches of pine boards. You will see 38 Special and 38 Smith & Wesson on this chart, and to prevent any confusion, I want to say now that they are two separate calibers. It was very easy to mix the two up because they are so similar. In fact, I mistakenly labeled the 38 Special at the top as the 38 Smith & Wesson, and for this I apologize. There is a noticeable difference in penetration of the two cartridges when both are used with a 6.5-inch barrel. It is also interesting to note that the velocity is very similar in this comparison, which leads me to wonder if the 38 Smith & Wesson was loaded with a much lighter bullet. It is also interesting to note that both 30 Luger ammunition and 30 Mauser ammunition can have similar amounts of penetration. There will be some calibers on these charts that most people will not recognize. For example, the 22 Savage High Power is like a more powerful 223 Remington. We also have the 30 Remington. This cartridge was intended to be used in semi-automatic rifles and was also intended to match the ballistics of the 33 Winchester. Since they were ballistically identical, if a question was asked about the penetration of one cartridge, it seemed to be acceptable to give the answer in the form of penetration numbers of the other cartridge. Likewise, 30 Remington was also referred to as 30-30 rimless. The 30-40 Winchester is ballistically similar to the 308, and it was used in military rifles for a relatively short period of time. The 303 Savage is also similar to the 308 ballistically, but it was intended to be used in lever-action rifles. The most interesting thing about this chart is that the 32 Special listed near the top has actually more penetration than one of the 9mm loads. Some people have killed brown bears with 32 Special rifles, but the general intent behind this cartridge is that it should be really used for small game. Which calls into question why exactly the 32 Special, which is not particularly powerful and is intended for small game, would have more penetration than the 9x57 that is intended for large dangerous game. It's obvious then that the intent behind the cartridge does not always result in penetration advantages in real use or in testing. Simply put, bullets with smaller diameters can get more penetration with less energy. To further demonstrate this point, I've created a chart with two different sources, and I'm comparing the 458 Win Mag with modern loads to the 9mm with older loads. I have highlighted the muzzle energy and put the penetration in bold print. With the 9mm Mauser, you can have half the power as some of the 458 Win Mag loads, but still have equal penetration. If you give the 9mm a marginal increase of power, you can significantly exceed the penetration of the 458 Win Mag loads. So some people may still desire to try to get more velocity out of the 458 Win Mag with more barrel length or with better loads. But we should be asking the question, why would we do that if we could use a smaller diameter bullet with significantly more penetration? This question directly applies to elephant hunting because elephants have thick skulls that you really want to use high-penetrating, non-expanding bullets on. There is no doubt that the 458 Win Mags with sufficient velocity can be used successfully on any elephant, but I personally do not think that that is the best tool for the job. Arguments in favor of larger calibers for elephant seem to be fairly dependent on situations that involve calibers that have more momentum, stunning or concussing the elephant's brain when you fail to make a good shot. Someone will likely ask why one of the 9mm Mauser loads has incorrect listed under its penetration, and the answer is that it was a soft point and that the penetration was exactly the same as the full metal jacket that was listed next to it. I should have actually put the word incorrect in the soft point category, and that was a mistake on my part. One of the 8mm Mauser rounds was steel jacketed. Using a metal that is cheaper than copper was important in war, but actually even more important for use against dangerous game like elephants. At this time, bullet construction was not given sufficient consideration, so a lot of bullets available were not particularly suited for life or death situations. So while large and powerful calibers like the .405 Winchester were theoretically better for such use, they did not have the bullet construction needed to consistently guarantee deep penetration through thick bone. Because of this, Charles Cotter was almost killed by an elephant when his .405 Winchester failed to be effective. So in my opinion, during this era, I would rather have an 8mm Mauser with steel-jacketed ammunition than a heavy recoiling .405 Winchester that may or may not be as effective. This is the second part of the video, and I'll be measuring penetration in 7/8 inch thick pine boards now. Again, we have handgun calibers, but this chart is a bit different. The problem I had is that it was not always clear if expanding or non-expanding ammunition was being used. So a lot more bullets are in the category of full metal jacket, even if they were probably lead, and this is due to the fact that lead bullets don't expand with certain calibers, and due to the previously mentioned uncertainty. I always try to list the barrel length and manufacturer of the ammunition if it is listed, but this is not always available. I think I should also mention that when 380 ACP came about, it was a time when some people, not all people, were starting to move away from revolvers. There were 9mm Lugers that were available at the time, so from a theoretical perspective, the more powerful 9mm Luger would be the obvious choice. However, when we compare the Browning tilting breech action against the Luger toggle lock action, it's extremely clear the Browning action has stood the test of time better. The Luger was a fairly complicated pistol and probably isn't the best choice for everyday carry when compared to a smaller .380 pistol. People had access to hollow points and soft points at this time for various calibers, but people back then didn't really put much importance on using expanding ammunition either for greater performance or for limiting unintended consequences from overpenetration. So the difficulties we have today with choosing a really good hollow point for .380 that has the proper amount of penetration and expansion, none of that really mattered to people when the .380 was invented. So the .380 today may not make a lot of sense to use in favor of 9mm, as it has become a reminder of an era that has passed. The .38 ACP is a largely forgotten caliber. It was very much like the 9mm both in power and bullet diameter, and it had a lot of use during this era, but over the years it has aged poorly. The .38 ACP is technically not in much use today, but the .38 Super is just a more powerful version of the .38 ACP. This means that reliability in auto-loading firearms is sometimes questionable due to the rims getting hung up. Neither of them have enough of a rim to be practically used in revolvers either. The 4440 was at one time a very popular caliber, and it was not forgotten because of a lack of effectiveness, but rather because popularity tends to be a fickle thing, and due to the advancement of time and the creation of new calibers. There is a tendency among people to arbitrarily pick a powerful caliber and use it as a ruler or minimum to judge other calibers against. Before it became the conventional wisdom that you needed a .44 Magnum or larger for bear defense, some people used 4440s and the very similar 3440 for this task. I say some people specifically because the general belief was at this time that no handgun was really suitable for hunting bear or for bear defense. I think it was fair to say that people at this time were more burdened by their ignorance and bias than people are today. After all, this was a time when they used toxic chemicals and asbestos casually without considering the consequences. I should clarify what I mean when I say this era, because I'm not talking about the creation of either of these cartridges. I'm talking about an era from roughly 1902 to 1922. I have read the first 3 decades of outdoor life, but the 2 decades I mentioned is where most of the penetration numbers have come from. There was a problem that the 3840, 4440, and 3220 had, and this was caused by their bottleneck design and the use of black powder. Black powder isn't very clean, and because of this, they had more extraction issues with such bottleneck cartridges. The most interesting thing on this chart is the very high penetration of the 250 3000 Savage full metal jacket round. The energy of this cartridge is not particularly impressive when compared to many other cartridges. For example, you can find 30-30 ammunition that is more powerful than the 250 Savage. To put this into context, he used what I believed was a standard 87 grain copper-jacketed bullet to kill the largest creature that walks this planet. I don't believe that any steel-jacketed 250 Savage rounds were ever made, but I could be wrong. You may also notice that some of the cartridges that I have shown have HV or high velocity next to them. This originally referred to ammunition that was loaded halfway in power between smokeless and black powder. As time progressed, this term lost its original value and seems to have been used more broadly for any smokeless powder load. Similarly, high power originally referred to cartridges that were loaded with smokeless powder. So if you had a cartridge that was originally designed for black powder and it was labeled high power, you could only use it in a firearm that had a more durable nickel steel barrel. Common soft metal barrels were only suitable for use with black powder cartridges. The 256 Newton also had very high penetration. It is another forgotten cartridge. It is interesting because it was similar in bullet weight and caliber to the 6.5 Creedmoor, but it has more velocity and power than the standard 6.5 Creedmoor of the same bullet weight. The 30-03 has an extremely high penetration. Very few people will know that it was the cartridge that the government was working on before it came out with the 30-06. If I remember correctly, you could use 30-06 ammunition in a 30-03 rifle, but not the other way around. I want to be clear though, the 30-03 should not be confused with the 303 British. The 32 Winchester self-loading cartridge was a bit of a strange idea. It was not particularly powerful or ballistically advantageous over pre-existing black powder cartridges. In addition, it was a semi-rimmed cartridge that was intended to be used in self-loading rifles. As I mentioned before, this really doesn't make sense to use semi-rimmed cartridges for auto-loading weapons because of reliability concerns. The 35 Winchester self-loading cartridge had limited popularity because of its fairly low power. The more powerful 351 Winchester self-loading was more versatile, though was still mostly useful at close ranges. The relatively recent creation of the 350 Legend was basically a reinvention of the obsolete 351 Winchester. They are very similar. If it wasn't for arbitrary caliber requirements for deer hunting in certain states, the 350 Legend would not likely have been invented in the first place. The 401 Winchester was the most powerful auto-loading cartridge for a good amount of time. Speaking of auto-loading rifles, the Mexican revolutionaries that overthrew Porfirio Diaz had some auto-loading rifles. I get somewhat irritated when people glorify the M1 Garand as being such a great weapon for war. They don't seem to understand that we could have used auto-loading, magazine-fed rifles, chambered in 30 Remington for both world wars. The 30 Remington was created in 1906 and was like a 30-30 that was made for self-loading rifles. Since U.S. involvement in World War I officially started in 1917, over a decade had passed since the creation of the 30 Remington at that point. We know now that intermediate calibers like 7.62x39, 30 Remington, and 5.56 are better suited for a general use infantry rifle than more powerful and heavier calibers like the 30-06. I mentioned the 405 Winchester before, and it had a significant amount of popularity among Americans that were hunting dangerous game in Africa. Probably the thing that sold the most of these rifles was Theodore Roosevelt's endorsement due to his use of it in Africa. The 50-110 Express had a similar amount of power, but not nearly as much penetration as the 405 Winchester did. Because of similar velocity and identical bullet weights of 300 grains, we can see exactly how much of a detriment increased diameter is to the penetration of full metal jackets. Now we get to the third part of the video, the information from Mike LaGrange's book. It was not specifically mentioned what wood Mike used in his testing, but after comparing the 9mm penetration to my previous charts, I believe that he was probably using pine boards as well. Some of the things presented here needed some side notes, which are shown at the top. One of the notes defies my understanding though. Note number 18 was about a full metal jacket that was listed as both intact and well expanded. Naturally, this statement is paradoxical, as both things can't be true. From this chart, we can see that the 30-06 at the top outpenetrated all the 458 Win Mag bullets at the bottom of the chart. Just to clarify, the rounds in question are both full metal jackets. Neither of them were designed for expansion. Obviously, the 375 H&H can have even more penetration than the 30-06 did. Of all the 470 Rigby bullets tested, we don't have really any impressive results. The 577 Nitro at the bottom of the chart has an immense amount of power, but only 41 inches of penetration. To put this into context, I showed a 32 Winchester Special before that had 43.5 inches of penetration. If people weren't so bogged down in the belief that you need large calibers to kill large things, we could have already made an innovation combination of rifle and ammunition that was designed to effectively kill the largest game with marginal recoil instead of very high recoil. Inches of penetration in pine boards was once used as a judge of a bullet's ability to inflict a casualty by the military. Likewise, penetration in pine boards, as well as at least having 58 foot-pounds of energy, was once considered to be a good way to judge the effectiveness of shrapnel. As time has progressed, we have advanced past such imperfect methods of determining effectiveness. It was discovered by accident that shrapnel that had fairly significant penetration in wood was also not particularly effective on actual creatures. Obviously, wood does not directly equate to some measurement in flesh and bone, but it is a reasonably good way of comparing different calibers in a way that helps us understand some of the characteristics of bullets. For example, I've mentioned in a previous video that a faster twist rate can increase penetration in wood when all else is the same. Likewise, from my research, I've seen that a cartridge that penetrates more than another one in actual use in animals does the same in wood. Finally, these are all my sources. If I had tried to keep track of which source was included with each individual piece of information, I would have driven myself mad. The only thing that I have left to say now is that I wish Michael LaGrange would write a new book so he could include some of the newer ammunition that is available today.